The thermal feed flickered once, then locked into frame. A figure, hooded and hunched, moved across a strip of hardened dirt between two corrugated shacks. The body posture was careful, not broken. The stride was deliberate despite the bindings. One of the analysts leaned closer, his fingers tapping quietly against the playback keys. The image ghosted for half a second as the drone banked east, then stabilized again. Facial geometry algorithms had already flagged the walk, a subtle pelvic swing to the left, right shoulder lower than average, upper thoracic lean that matched prior field recordings at 87%. But the room didn't speak in percentages. It spoke in clearance codes, mission numbers, and timestamps. The air was cold from the server racks. A coffee pot sat untouched near the wall. The smell burnt and metallic. Screens washed the room in shifting green light, the color of night vision and monitored mistakes. Overlapping voices murmured about packet lag and signal drift. Nothing about the woman on the screen. Commander Evelyn Shaw stood at the rear of the room, arms folded, not blinking. Her expression didn't change when the figure passed into a second doorway and vanished from thermal view. She didn't move when the feed looped back to the start. But when someone muttered that the ID wasn't strong enough to act, she quietly corrected him. "It's her," she said. "That's Rachel Marin." No one answered directly. The analyst at the table glanced at her, then at the screen, then back at his notes. On the monitor, a red tag lit beneath the image, "Red Hook, status compromised." A moment later, a different feed took over. Maps, weather projections, tidal movement, a coastal village on the Horn of Africa, marked by a cluster of concentric red arcs. Operation Shadow Hook, the title read, with a timestamp no more than 3 hours old. In another room, under a lower ceiling and with harsher fluorescent lights, Chief Petty Officer Dean Keller stood in silence. His name was the only one not read aloud during the mission brief. He listened to the description of the village, the dockless inlet, the predictable moon tide, the narrow sea trail that could only be accessed by submerged delivery vehicle. The operation lead, a captain from Atlantic Command, kept the tone even. One American asset, compromised cover, believed to be in transit to an inland stronghold. The window for insertion was under 4 hours. Extraction must be completed before 0400 Zulu. There would be no air support, no follow-on assets, no acknowledgement. It was, by all accounts, a standard deniable black op. But Keller didn't believe in standard. He believed in timing, and something about this one had stalled too long before being greenlit. Lieutenant Marcus Van sat one row back, scribbling notes between timing pulses from the satellite relay. He was younger, sharper in the way comms officers were supposed to be. His eyes flicked toward the packet list every time the feed paused for less than a second. He leaned slightly toward Keller. "Command says her tracker burned out 48 hours ago," he said quietly. "But the thermal pickup shows she's still moving under her own power." Keller didn't look at him. Means she knew it was blown. Means she kept walking anyway. Van nodded once and didn't speak again. The others around them listened without really hearing. There were nods at the phrases they expected: coastal fog, local irregulars, overlapping warlord networks. None of them asked why the footage had only surfaced now. Or why the prior signal from Red Hook had been ignored for a full day and a half. At the end of the briefing, Keller folded his mission packet into thirds and tucked it into his sleeve. He didn't ask questions. He simply walked out, one step slower than necessary. Outside the room, the hallway smelled like old concrete and jet fuel. The ops officer followed behind him and said, almost as an afterthought, that if he could get the asset clear, it would help the optics of another stalled mission. Keller stopped walking. "We're not pulling her for optics," he said. "We're pulling her because she was left out there long enough to start pulling herself." Back in Langley, the screen had already shifted to another feed. Evelyn Shaw watched as the exfil map cycled again, the water route lighting up with blue lines leading back to the submarine's extraction arc. She didn't need to say it aloud. but it stayed with her all the same. This mission wasn't approved because of what they saw. It was approved because someone finally noticed who they left behind. The ocean didn't speak. It pressed. A slow, steady weight against every breath drawn through the rebreathers. The water around the SEAL delivery vehicle held a dense, moonless black, broken only by the occasional glint of phosphorescence when the propellers stalled and the men drifted in silence. Chief Petty Officer Dean Keller was the first to surface. His mask came off slowly, water pouring down his neck seal in a thin stream. Behind him, 4 others emerged one by one, all moving in tight arcs. Their gear was slick with salt, rifles secured, optics fogged and then cleared. They lay half-submerged in the mangrove inlet, just off the coast of the Horn of Africa, waiting until the wind shifted over the canopy. Only when it moved did Keller give the silent hand signal forward. Each man crawled up through the shallows. The sand sucked at their boots with every step. Vines reached down from overgrowth and snagged at pack straps, but no one spoke. Behind them, the SDV slowly slid back beneath the surface. Motor cut, pre-timed to drift out and anchor at fallback position. The water left no trace of them. That was the point. It always was. The shoreline narrowed into a trail of stone and brush. Keller raised his fist and the team dropped into formation. Lieutenant Marcus Van moved to his left flank, brushing salt from his earpiece. He tapped the side of his tablet twice, calibrating its filter set for signal bleed. The screen lit up in dull green pulses, faint lines marking the invisible noise of the village just ahead. The structures came into view slowly. Shacks of thin, salt-warped wood, tarps for roofs. A few kerosene lamps gave off warm halos inside doorways, painting silhouettes on the walls behind them. 2 men with slung AKs walked a perimeter path. One of them coughed twice. Neither wore boots. The dirt road between them had a centerline worn deeper than their footprints. Van paused behind a pile of stacked crab pots and focused on the screen. There was chatter on Open Band's market talk, shortwave news, the low hum of a generator. But something didn't align. The waveform for one of the short bursts sat wrong. Not in tone, in timing. He rewound it twice and played it again at half speed. The packet ended 200 milliseconds late, not enough to trip an alarm, but enough for someone looking for it. He kept his voice low. "Chief, I've got something. Not a transmission. A pulse, offset delay in static carrier. Could be a buried ID ping." Keller didn't look. Repeat cycle. Confirm pattern. Van adjusted the frequency filter and let it roll again. The anomaly repeated. Not a voice. Not a code. Just a delayed signature wrapped in ambient frequency, small enough to be mistaken for compression artifact. It sat within the margin of noise. Offset is consistent. Same delay every 3 seconds. Same carrier shift. Van exhaled. That's not random. Keller nodded once. Red hook. The word didn't echo. It simply hung there, weightless in the dark. They moved again. This time slower. Not an exfil anymore. Not exactly. Now it was trace and confirm. The delay meant she was still alive, but it also meant she knew better than to call for help directly. The signal was a whisper sent sideways, buried where only someone listening to the gaps would find it. They stalked through a narrow cut between shacks. The alley smelled of diesel and fish. Rusted drums leaned against concrete posts. A single clothesline ran across the upper beam. Van ducked under it and checked the ping again. Still present. Still consistent. The others fanned wide. Breath fogged faintly in front of their faces, barely visible in the thermal overlay from their goggles. Suppressed rifles came forward, not raised, just ready. Movement was deliberate. No loose gear, no fast steps. Every touch was gloved. Every boot landed with full control of weight and angle. A dog barked once 3 houses over. A door creaked on a steel hinge but didn't open. Someone muttered in Somali, words slurred with fatigue. Then silence returned. Keller held at a sidewall and adjusted his optic. He tapped twice on the wrist-mounted screen. syncing with Van. Direction. Van angled toward the west edge of the village. Signal shifts left of the main path. 2 structures out, probably undercover. They changed their movement pattern. Wide sweep. Minimal exposure. One man moved to overwatch on the incline. Another cut a back path behind the generators. The rest looped through brush and reed, following the offset signal, careful not to cross light or gravel. They reached the edge of a long, low building covered in sheet metal. The door was padlocked from the outside, but there was a rear hatch barely visible beneath a collapsed lean-to. Van crouched beside it and tapped the side twice. The offset signal pulsed once more, then stopped. Keller whispered, "She knows we're here." Van didn't reply. He just nodded and began setting the breaching charge. The water hadn't spoken when they came ashore, but it had taken their name when they left it behind. Whatever they were walking into now, it wasn't just recovery. It was contact. The breaching charge pulsed twice in Keller's hand, then hissed in silence as it burned the lock. The rear hatch gave way with a faint click, the metal folding inward like wet cardboard. Inside, the air shifted. Heat radiated from the walls, held in by corrugated aluminum and sealed plywood. It smelled of salt, dried sweat, and the faint trace of disinfectant. The first beam of red-filtered light cut across the floor. Dust floated in the path. A chain rattled once. No voice called out. Keller led the way inside, rifle drawn but low, boots landing heel to toe on the uneven concrete. The team fanned in behind him. One flashlight swept across crates stacked along the left wall. Another caught a pair of bare feet, dusty, motionless, ankles bound. Rachel Marin sat slouched against the far corner, hands tied in front of her with plastic cuffs that had dug into her skin. Her lip was split. A bruise ringed the outer edge of her left eye. But she didn't flinch. Her eyes met Keller's and didn't blink. Her face barely moved, but her fingers shifted. One hand flexed in a subtle sequence. Not alone. Van moved forward, checked the immediate perimeter, then nodded clear. Keller crouched beside her. "Red Hook," he said, quiet and even. Rachel breathed in through her nose. "Took long enough," she said. Her voice was low, rough from dehydration. Keller reached for his knife and started cutting the cuffs. "Where's the signal?" he asked. She tilted her head toward the rear wall, piggybacked off their generator chatter. 3-second delay in the third harmonic. "It's not logged anywhere." "Signal confirmed," Van muttered behind them, half to himself. Rachel flexed her hands once, winced, then pointed to a wooden divider near the rear of the shack. Her hand made a half-turn, palm down, as if bracing against something she didn't want to say aloud. Keller signaled, and the second man moved forward. The partition wasn't locked. It was wedged with wire. When they pulled it free, the wood swung open to reveal a narrow second room, barely wider than a closet. The beam of red light caught on the edge of a cot, rusted and sagging in the center. A man sat against the back wall, arms zip-tied, body slumped, but upright. He didn't move when the light hit him. His eyes were open but unfocused. His clothes were damp and clung to his skin. His hair was matted to one side. His wrists were raw from the bindings. For a moment, no one said anything. Keller knelt beside him. "Name." The man didn't speak. His gaze drifted toward Keller's hand, then to the light, then back down. He blinked once. Rachel stepped closer. "His name is Paul Reiner," she said. "Civilian contractor. Field systems specialist. He was captured 9 weeks ago." Van looked up sharply. 9. They ghosted him early. No trace. No request. His file was purged from the roster 2 months ago. She wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist and crouched. "He's the hook. I was the cover. They used me to keep him viable. He doesn't have a drive. He memorized it." Keller kept his eyes on Reiner. "What's he holding?" "Names, transfer routes, proxy signatures, Tier 1 traffic, some of it. NATO flagged." Rachel leaned against the wall and closed her eyes for a moment. He was watching the contractors. the ones who move arms through hostages. My job was to confirm the buyers. Van stepped back toward the entry point. We need to call this in now. Extraction just got doubled. Keller didn't move. No. Van turned. Chief, if we don't log this, Command doesn't prep the fallback arc. If Command stalled her exfil, Keller said, voice low, what makes you think they want us pulling the other one? Rachel opened her eyes again and looked at Keller. You're not wrong. Van didn't argue further. He stepped back into position and rechecked the exterior feed. Still quiet. But his hands moved faster now. Sweat traced along his temple. Keller stood and reached for the second set of flex cuffs. He mobile. Rachel shook her head. Not on his own. We carry him. She didn't respond with words. She just stepped forward and pulled Reiner's arm gently over her shoulder. He didn't resist. He also didn't help. But his weight shifted with hers. The team realigned. The interior shack stayed dark. No signs of forced confinement remained beyond the bindings. No guards, no signals, just a trap left burning quietly in the dark. As they stepped out into the night, Keller looked at Rachel one more time. Her face was swollen and streaked with dust, but her eyes were steady, tracking angles, checking corners. She didn't need orders. She was already back in the op. Red filtered light faded behind them as the door closed. The shack vanished again into silence. They moved fast and low, following the narrow path between the buildings toward the tree line that opened onto the southern beach. The night air clung to their gear like steam. Reiner was half limp, weight spread between Rachel and the rear operator. His boots dragged once, then caught rhythm with Keller's lead. They were 100 meters from the extraction point when the silhouette of a child flashed across the alley mouth. Keller froze. The child, barefoot and shirtless, looked no older than 10. He blinked once at the men, at the rifles, at the wounded man sagging between them. Then he turned and vanished into the dark. No one breathed. A second later, somewhere deeper in the village, a metal can clattered against a wall. Then a chime rang once sharp and metallic, like a snapped tension wire. It echoed in the air with no urgency, no panic. But Keller knew the sound. Passive tripwire alarm. Silent perimeter trigger. The alert would reach a lookout before they hit the sand. Move, he said. They sprinted for the tree line. The air thickened as they broke into open ground. Fog rolling in from the surf. Heat shimmered off the earth where torches had burned earlier in the evening. The smell of burnt cooking oil and smoke hung in the air. In the distance, the hull of the extraction boat floated low in the water, engine ticking on standby, barely audible. They were 20 meters from the water when the first muzzle flashes lit the far side of the brush. Rounds zipped low and wide, cutting diagonals across the sand. The SEAL on point dropped to a knee and returned fire with 2 tight bursts. The suppressor hissed. Another round tore through the air, and someone shouted. A man went down hard in the rear column. Rachel pulled Reiner to the ground behind a rock slab. Van dropped beside the downed SEAL, checking for vitals with one hand while unclipping the radio pack with the other. He keyed in the primary channel, speaking low. Command, this is Shadow Actual. We are compromised. Engaging at extraction point. Request immediate reroute. Static hissed back, then silence, then the same hiss again. Keller glanced over his shoulder. Try it again. Van toggled to backup. Shadow Actual to Aegis. Come in on fallback 1. Do you copy? The signal pulsed, then crackled back with a faint ghost of his own voice. Shadow Actual to Aegis. Come in. It was his message, looped and delayed, fed back through the circuit, not jammed, not broken, rerouted through something external. Someone had bent the relay arc. They're not answering, Van said, his voice sharp. Rachel pushed Reiner flat and climbed halfway to her knees, scanning for shooters. They're not coming, she said. They want a closed loop. No signals. No witnesses. She looked at Keller, eyes hard. The last message I sent got tagged green. Said Shadowhook secured. I thought it meant extraction. It didn't. It meant resolution. More rounds hit the surf. The boat jolted once, its side riddled by impacts. Smoke curled from its engine bay. Whoever was on board tried to swing it around, but a second burst struck the waterline. The boat started drifting sideways, engine coughing once, then going silent. "We're burned," Keller said. "We fall back. North route." Cave Van asked. Keller nodded. "Now." The team changed direction, cutting hard left into the underbrush. The path was barely visible, covered in fronds and brittle branches that cracked under weight. They moved fast, guns up, breath ragged. The wounded SEAL was conscious, but barely. Rachel took Reiner again, half carrying, half pushing him forward with one arm around his back. The cave was an old fallback site from a prior op, barely marked on the satellite overlays. Van had updated the route in his private nav log before they deployed. No one outside the team knew about it. Behind them, voices shouted in another dialect, footsteps scattering across the ridge. The sound of the boat tearing open had stopped. No more engine, just tide and fog. They broke through the tree line again and followed the slope upward. Reiner collapsed once, Rachel catching him hard with her shoulder. She didn't stop. She didn't ask for help. She just reset her footing and dragged him along. Keller held position at the entrance of the cave as the rest of the team slipped inside. The wounded man was last, flanked by two others. Once everyone was in, Keller dropped the weighted thermal net across the opening. Visibility dropped to near zero. The cave smelled of wet stone and old air. Inside, Van dropped to one knee and finally spoke. "It's not just comms. The packet path was rewritten. Someone delayed it on purpose." Rachel set Reiner down gently, then leaned back against the rock wall, her arms shaking. "They're closing the file. Both of us. Maybe all of you." Keller didn't respond. He walked to the far end of the cave, checked the air duct, then came back and sat down beside the team. Outside, the fog thickened. Inside, there was only breath, silence, and a signal that would never reach home. The cave held its silence like a sealed vault. No one spoke for the first few minutes. Only the shallow rhythm of breathing filled the narrow stone space. The walls were slick with moisture, condensation rolling down uneven ledges and gathering in small depressions near the floor. It was cooler here, but the heat from the sprint still clung to their gear and skin. Reiner lay propped against a curved rock, his eyes half-lidded, mouth slightly open, chest rising and falling with shallow effort. The thermal blanket had been pulled across the entrance in two overlapping layers. The second man on watch stayed crouched at the inner flap, rifle balanced across his knees, watching for movement in the heat signature just beyond the seams. No light, no sound, no sign. Van sat near the back with his radio array stripped to its internal components. He worked by feel and glow, a soft green pulse from the diagnostic interface barely lighting the wires between his knees. The rest of the team sat in a wide half circle, their positions loose but alert. No one had unpacked food or water yet. No one assumed this was rest. Rachel finally broke the silence. "Only my handler knew where I was," she said. Her voice was quiet but carried. "And Amani. That's it." Keller didn't look up. He was sharpening the edge of his backup blade on a flat stone, slow, even strokes that barely made a sound. Van's fingers stilled over the radio. The screen pulsed once, then paused, showing a faint packet echo with partial metadata. He tapped through the log, watching the delay pattern. Then it arrived a whisper-length transmission, marked urgent but buried under layer routing. He read it twice, then once more. He spoke without raising his head. "Shadowhook compromised. Delay confirmation until asset is neutralized." Rachel didn't move. Keller stopped sharpening. Van added, "Packet origin is internal. Langley switchboard. Hidden sender. No bounce. That's a direct relay." The words hung there, dense and inert. Rachel sat cross-legged now, arms resting on her knees. Reiner wasn't listed because he was never supposed to be found. He memorized a full procurement chain, itemized schedules, defense to civilian handoffs, proxy buyers from NATO-aligned states with cutout approval. She ran a hand through her damp hair. I was embedded with the buyers, monitoring behaviors, timelines. I wasn't there to extract him. I was there to confirm the volume before it moved. And when you did, Keller asked. They scrubbed the uplink, ghosted my handler, then cut my ping. Van leaned back against the wall. The damp stone pressed into his shoulder blades. He didn't seem to notice. Rachel looked down at Reiner, who had not stirred. His job was to remember. Mine was to blend. Once he'd recited the sequence under pressure, they didn't need him anymore. Once I verified, they didn't need me either. Keller set his blade aside. That packet was authorization. It was a delay to silence. Rachel replied, "No recovery. Just time to let it bury itself." One of the men shifted at the flap, watching a faint distortion in the air beyond. Nothing moved. Van clicked off the array, then set the battery aside. "We could go open band," he said, not hopeful. "Ping a relay drone. Spoof it into logging the pickup and force command to respond." Keller shook his head once. "We do that. We kill all three of you. They'll let it burn hot. Let the signal confirm the threat." Rachel reached into her belt. Her hand came back with a small black capsule, shaped like a pill bottle, capped with a single red ring at the top. She held it in her palm for a long moment, staring at it as if weighing whether to say anything at all. This was for final position logging, last resort, never meant to be used. Keller looked at the object. "That's your burn key." Rachel nodded. "All it does is archive my data. Secure boot, full lockdown, location scrub, uploads to one isolated drop node. If I had used it sooner, you wouldn't have found me." She set it on the rock in front of her. No one touched it. The cave felt smaller now. The walls closer. Outside, water dripped from a runoff ledge and splattered against the ground with quiet regularity. The sound was steady, natural, but every ear inside the cave held still for it, as if bracing for change. Keller finally said, "We move before first light, North Ridge. Keep low and cold." Rachel nodded. She looked at Reiner again, her voice quieter now. "If we don't make it out, you need to carry what he knows." Van glanced at the capsule. "What's in that drive?" Rachel answered without looking at him. "Enough to burn 3 agencies, and at least one of our own." No one asked anything else. They didn't need to. The truth had already landed, low and final. Keller gave the order without ceremony. Kill the beacon. Van reached for the transmitter at the base of his radio rig, pulled a cable out of the housing, and drew his knife. The edge bit into the sheath with a faint grind. He twisted once. A strand of copper curled away and snapped. The locator light blinked twice, then died. The feed was gone. No more pings. No fallback confirmation. No scheduled handoff. They were no longer visible to anyone, even those pretending to look. Rachel sat near the thermal net and pulled her boot off slowly. She flipped the sole inward, revealing a secondary RFID patch pressed beneath the arch. Her hands moved with practiced calm. She took a field heater from her belt, cracked the chemical seal, and waited for the coil to glow red. When it did, she pressed it to the patch. A faint sizzle rose in the cave air, the scent of burned polymer mixed with damp stone. When it stopped, she dropped the smoldering tag and crushed it under the heel of her boot. She checked her belt next, then unpinned a small chip from the inner lining. That one she burned until it curled. Keller watched without comment. The rest of the team followed suit, stripping down gear and pulling any item that could ping, trace, or relay. Devices were placed into a canvas bag with a magnetic clasp. One of the men carried it to the far end of the cave and wedged it into a crevice behind the rocks. They were ghosts now, even to their own side. Rachel pulled her pack tight and stood, slightly hunched from strain. "There's a tunnel," she said. "Old smuggling path. Starts under a collapsed fishery near the southern edge. You'll miss it unless you already know the lean angle of the roof." "Leads to the sea," Keller asked. "North outlet, sea vent near the reef shelf." He nodded. "Take point." She didn't ask for confirmation. She simply turned and moved. The team followed single file, weapons low, gear stowed against their chests. Reiner was carried between 2 operators. His weight slumped but not dead. His eyes were half open now, responding to shifts in balance. He said nothing. The village had gone quiet again. The earlier gunfire had drawn response, but the enemy had assumed they'd run. No one expected a retreat back through the center of the grid. That was the gamble, and that was the only option left. They crossed the brush in silence, stepped between burnt-out shacks and twisted metal gates. The fishery appeared as a collapsed shell on the east side, its frame canted forward, roof dipped at a sharp angle. Rachel slowed near the back wall and ran her fingers along a broken seam. She pressed one rusted panel, hard, and it gave way with a faint clack. A crawl space opened beneath it, dark, wet, lined in brick and older than the village above. She dropped in first. The space barely allowed shoulders through. The others followed in sequence. Reiner passed through last. Inside. The air was heavy with mildew and salt rot. It pressed close to the lungs, thicker than fog, closer than smoke. The floor was uneven and soaked. Water pooled in sections. Moss clung to the lower edges of the walls. Their boots slid more than once. They used hands and knees, shuffling gear, moving without sound. Each step came with the dull grind of movement pressed through a space not meant for motion. 15 meters in. Rachel stopped and pressed her hand against a cornerstone. It looked identical to the rest. But she reached into her jacket and pulled a small pry bar from her inner lining, slipped it into the gap, and levered up until the panel came free. Behind it was a vacuum-sealed pouch, buried inside a hollowed-out brick cavity. She pulled it free without ceremony and handed it to Keller. He didn't ask. He didn't open it. He simply nodded and slipped it into the central fold of his gear harness. He clicked the clasp once. Nothing more. Rachel paused. Her breath caught for a second. Then she whispered, "If I don't make it, you show them. Use that drive." Keller met her eyes in the dark. "You make it." They kept moving. The tunnel narrowed again before it angled upward. It sloped toward light. Not bright, but faint. The color of seawater under cloud cover. The sound of the ocean grew louder as they neared the exit. It came in as pulses, dull thuds against rock, echoing inside the narrow vent. The last stretch required crawling over barnacled stone and slick channels of water that came and went with the tide. The exit was narrow, barely wider than a torso. It opened into a shallow tidal basin surrounded by rock. The reef shelf was visible in the near distance, shaped like a crescent in the whitecaps. The mini-sub rendezvous was beyond it, waiting on blind timer. Keller checked the light once. No glow, no drone shadow, no signal, just the ocean and the clock. They would swim for it. No markers, no fallback. Truth was in the pouch strapped to his chest, and the rest was on the current. The fog made it almost impossible to tell where the land ended and the ocean began. The rocks along the shoreline glistened with mist. Every wave broke in near silence, swallowed by the thickness of air and salt. There was no sound from behind, no voices, no motion through the brush. Still, the seals moved without hesitation, spreading into a wide crescent along the edge of the water, rifles scanning as they prepared for final approach. The mini-sub was barely visible, only a dark outline bobbing just beyond the reef break. Its running lights were off, its propulsion silent. No signal came from it. The rendezvous was pre-timed, locked into an untraceable arc. Either it was there, or it wasn't. That was the last gamble left. Rachel tightened the straps across Reiner's chest, then looped his arm over her shoulder. He couldn't help much, but he didn't resist. He was awake now, barely, eyes glazed but focused on the water. When he tried to speak, she shook her head and pointed forward. He nodded once. Van pulled a small encoder from his pouch, flipped up the housing, and activated the ghost relay. It pulsed amber once, then twice. The signal path fractured across international channels, bouncing from open-air civilian bands to neutral satellites, bending off every packet wall it could reach. He uploaded the first packet from the sealed drive, routing it through a secure hash disguised as Reiner's old contractor ID string. The payload was small, only metadata, but it was enough to test the path. The screen blinked. The packet went out. No reply came back. They entered the water in sequence. The cold hit immediately, sharp and biting through the fabric of their gear. Salt stung every cut and abrasion. Rachel held Reiner steady as they pushed off the rocks. He floated with his head back, barely responsive but conscious. The other swam in a silent formation, long strokes moving through the black water like shadows between currents. The fog only thickened. It twisted every sound, folding waves back onto themselves. The distance to the sub felt longer than it should have. The silhouette would appear, then disappear behind vapor. No one spoke. Every breath came loud through mouthpieces, each kick dragging salt through muscle already exhausted. When they reached the sub, Keller was the first to grip the side rail. He hauled himself up and turned to help the next man. Rachel came last, guiding Reiner's arm over the step until the others pulled him inside. Once aboard, the hatch sealed shut with a dull clunk. The hum of pressurization filled the space. The sub was old, stripped of everything not essential. Just the nav console, ballast controls, and a repeater bank linked to a buried node near the sea floor. Van connected the transmitter. The screen pulsed again, amber, steady, waiting. The packet showed as delivered. No green, no blue, no confirmation. Just the line away. Keller exhaled and slumped against the wall, eyes closed. Rachel leaned back against the interior hull, water dripping from her sleeves, hair plastered to her face. She didn't say anything. Her gaze stayed fixed on the floor between her boots. Nobody cheered, nobody moved. The ocean held its silence around them, and the truth was now adrift, somewhere in the global dark. The op center was empty, lit only by the glow of standby monitors. The overhead lights were off. A cleaning crew had passed through hours earlier, leaving behind the faint scent of alcohol wipes and machine oil. Commander Evelyn Shaw stood alone at the central console, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the screen. The relay pinged once. A low chime. Nothing more. One line of data appeared in the feed log partial packet received. No header, no source code, just raw metadata. She read it in silence. Rachel Marin, Paul Reiner, encrypted chain signatures. The timestamp matched the ghost window she'd marked in her own files 3 days earlier. Footsteps approached behind her. A junior aide stepped into the room, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Did we get her back?" he asked, voice tentative. Evelyn didn't turn around. Her gaze never left the screen. "No," she said quietly. "We didn't. But she gave us the hook." She tapped the keyboard once. The packet logged under a non-indexed string, buried where no automated parser would touch it. The aide said nothing more. Evelyn watched the final trace fade from the screen, her expression unchanged, her silence full.